Something was amiss at 7-Star Fold, Beeston in Leeds, in the early summer of 1900. On the evening of Friday, the 8th of June, the quiet hum of routine suddenly gave way to whispers of unease, for it was the last time anyone laid eyes on 33-year-old Marion Blewitt or her husband, Charles. That morning, at precisely 8:30 a.m., Robert Coffey of No. 8-Star Fold had noticed Marion going about her usual business, scrubbing her doorstep with the diligence of habit. She seemed as ordinary as ever, lost in the mundane rhythm of domestic life. But then, as dusk descended and shadows stretched long across the cobbled street, a subtle shift in the air signaled something strange. At 8:45 p.m., Coffey spotted Charles Oliver Blewitt, moving purposefully past No. 8, slipping toward the back entrance of his own home. Nothing seemed out of place, until, a mere 15 minutes later, Sarah Harrison of No. 4 caught sight of Marion standing at her doorstep. And then, nothing. From that moment onward, neither Marion nor Charles were seen again. Their home, once open and bustling with life, had fallen into eerie silence. The door stood locked. The blinds were drawn, the world outside kept turning, but within those four walls, something had shifted, something unexplained, something unresolved. 4 days, Thomas Armitage prowled the narrow alleyway of Star Fold, his patience thinning with every unanswered knock. On the 11th of June, he made his rounds, collecting rent from the tenants, but when he reached No. 7, the Blewitt house, he found the door stubbornly shut. No reply. No movement within. He returned, time and time again, his irritation mounting. But the silence behind that door remained unbroken. Finally, on the 17th of June, he came not alone. At his side stood James Bunny and his wife, Jemima, Charles Blewitt's mother. The couple, too, had been trying to gain entry, Jemima desperate to retrieve her belongings. But Thomas Armitage was, above all, a businessman, and access came at a price. Before the Bunnies could step inside, they would first pay the outstanding rent, 5 shillings and 6pence. A final attempt. The trio stood before the door of No. 7, its frame dark and unyielding. Armitage rapped his knuckles against the wood, each strike louder, more forceful. Silence. Nothing. Without hesitation, he seized a pickaxe, lifted it high, and brought it down with a mighty swing. Splinters flew. The door cracked and groaned under the assault. And then, at last, it gave way. James Bunny was the first to step inside, his breath shallow, his pulse quickening as his eyes adjusted to the dim light. There, in the chair, sat Marion Blewitt, motionless, draped in a heavy shawl that hung unnaturally over her frame. A hesitant hand reached forward, peeling back the fabric. Gasps escaped from behind him. Her throat had been viciously cut. The silence was shattered as the police were summoned. Footsteps thundered through the house, searching every shadow for an answer, something, anything, to make sense of the carnage. Their eyes landed on an array of potential murder weapons. 2 hatchets, 3 carving knives, each honed to a razor's edge. But more chilling was the sight of 2 knives, their blades tainted with what appeared to be blood. Of Charles Blewitt, however, there was no trace. He had vanished, slipping beyond the reach of justice, at least for now. But the police were hunting him with a desperate fervor. The inquest commenced at the Railway Hotel, Beeston, on the 18th of June, the air thick with speculation and grim anticipation. City Coroner J.C. Malcolm presided, listening as George Jackson, the victim's brother, delivered only the necessary confirmation of her identity. The proceedings dragged on, postponed again on the 25th of June, the unanswered questions festering like an open wound. And when they reconvened on the 2nd of July, one haunting claim surfaced, that, by all accounts, Charles and Marion Blewitt had lived in harmony. A chilling contradiction. A man missing. A woman dead. And a truth still lost in the dark that no witness could be found to recall a single quarrel, a raised voice, or the slightest disturbance between them. And yet, the wounds on Marion's body, brutal, deliberate, were declared impossible to have been self-inflicted. Someone had done this to her. Then, on the 2nd of July, in the hushed stillness of the house, investigators uncovered chilling new evidence. A second, more thorough search revealed a 6-chambered revolver, its cold metal gleaming in the dim light. But what lay tucked away in a chest of drawers was far more revealing, a marriage certificate. Superintendent Gillespie himself retrieved it, the faded ink spelling out the names: Charles Oliver Blewitt of Copperhouse, Cornwall, and Mary Ann Jackson, joined in matrimony on the 20th of August, 1896. And with it, a note, aged, fragile, yet unmistakably poignant. The words, written in her own hand, carried the weight of some unspoken plea. "Please save these marriage lines for me while I want them. Your sister, Mary Ann Blewitt, number 7, Star Fold, Beeston." The significance of these findings was undeniable. But the question remained, what hidden truth still lurked within the shadows of that house? The handwriting was unmistakable, Mary Ann's own. Her brother, George Jackson, confirmed it, his voice steady yet weighted with an unspoken dread. She had entrusted the marriage lines to him for safekeeping, but something had changed. 2 months ago, she had asked for them back, without explanation. No hints, no whispered fears, just the quiet insistence of a woman who perhaps, in the depths of her mind, had begun to doubt the security of her own marriage. Then came the verdict. The inquest jury did not deliberate long. The evidence was undeniable, the story chilling in its implications. This was no accident. No tragic misunderstanding. It was murder. And the man responsible? The missing husband, Charles Oliver Blewitt. Urgency electrified the courtroom. He had vanished into the shadows, but he would not stay hidden forever. Now, the hunt began. Every second lost meant justice delayed. And justice was coming for him. 2 witnesses finally emerged, their accounts shedding the first slivers of light on the fate of Charles Blewitt. One of them, James Boschel, an engineer by trade but also a hand in his uncle's hairdressing shop at 59 Town Street, Beeston, recalled an ordinary evening on the 8th of June, sometime between 7 o'clock and 8 p.m. Blewitt had walked in, his demeanor guarded, his eyes flickering with something unspoken. He sat down and requested a drastic change. A full moustache and a week's worth of beard, gone. At the time, it seemed like nothing more than routine grooming. But in hindsight, the truth became undeniable. He had been concealing something. He was a man on the run. And he was changing his appearance to vanish. The second witness was Constable Blackburn, stationed at Staincliffe, Batley. It was the dead of night, 3:30 a.m. on June 9th, when he spotted a solitary figure moving through the darkness along Halifax Road, coming from the direction of Dewsbury. A man, unknown to him. It was an unnatural hour for a lone traveller, and something about him, his pace, his quiet intent, stirred suspicion. Blackburn stopped him. "What are you doing out at this hour?" The man's answer was measured, careful. He had come from Morley, he said, and was heading to Heckmondwike, hoping to find work in the collieries. If unsuccessful, he would move on to Barnsley. His voice betrayed nothing. His manner was calm. Blackburn walked with him for half a mile, his trained eye assessing every detail. The man was clean-shaven. Too clean. As though he had only recently shed his old identity. It was only later, when the weight of all the evidence had settled, that the constable was certain, the man he had bid good night that night, the stranger on the road, had been none other than Charles Blewitt. The breakthrough, when it came, was swift. A handful of men in Halifax began whispering among themselves, uneasy with the growing certainty that their new workmate bore an uncanny resemblance to the wanted man. And then, the stranger himself had made an admission, he had arrived only recently from Leeds. So it was that, on the morning of July 3rd at precisely 10 a.m., a man calling himself Oliver Jackson stepped into the foundry of Redmond Brothers, machine toolmakers on Parkinson Lane, Halifax. He had come expecting the routine rhythm of a workday. What he did not expect was to be summoned to the manager's office. A reprimand, perhaps. He had been late, after all. With measured steps, Jackson complied. But when he entered, he was greeted not by a disgruntled supervisor but by a gentleman who introduced himself with quiet authority, Detective Inspector Bradley of the Halifax Borough Police. Bradley's questions were simple. His gaze unwavering. "What is your name?" A pause. Then the reply, calm, assured. "Oliver Jackson." Bradley nodded. And then, as if peeling back a carefully placed disguise, he asked again, "What was your name before you came to Halifax?" Jackson hesitated. It was only a moment, but in that fraction of time, everything unraveled. And then came the words that sealed his fate. "Well, my name's Charles Blewitt." The arrest was immediate. The charge, murder. The trial was no longer a possibility but a certainty. On the 4th of July, Blewitt stood before the magistrates in Leeds. The weight of his crime pressed upon the room, though his defense, Mr. Arthur Willey, stood at his side. But in the eyes of the law, the hunt was over. The murderer had been found. The prosecution revealed only the barest details of the case at Blewitt's first appearance before the magistrates. Mr. T. Thornton kept his statements measured, precise, just enough to ensure that Blewitt was remanded until July 12. But when that second hearing arrived, the veil was lifted. The full story of Blewitt's flight to Halifax unfolded. He had taken lodgings with Mrs. Elizabeth and Lamb at Dunkirk Street on June 12, arriving at around 5:30 p.m. His demeanor was calm, his explanation simple: he had come from Leeds. That evening, as Mrs. Lamb took his coat to hang it up, something small and metallic slipped from his pocket. A razor. At first, she thought little of it. After all, it was hardly unusual for a man to carry such a thing. But as the days passed, Mrs. Lamb couldn't shake the feeling. Something about her new lodger unsettled her. His movements, his words, there was something off-kilter, something carefully restrained. And now, with the weight of his crime revealed, she knew she had housed a fugitive. The morning after Jackson had left for work, Elizabeth found herself unsettled by a growing unease. Something about him, his movements, his presence, had gnawed at her the night before. And now, as she stepped into his room, the feeling solidified. The bed. Untouched. As if no one had lain there at all. Her gaze dropped to the floor. A pair of underpants. An undershirt. Carelessly discarded, yet bearing something far more troubling: stains. Dark, indistinct, but unmistakably blood-stained. A quiet dread crept over her. She had harbored doubts about her lodger from the start, but now, faced with undeniable evidence that something was deeply wrong, Elizabeth made her decision. That evening, when the man returned for dinner, she met him with cold resolve. He would not be staying another night. She sent him on his way, telling him in no uncertain terms to find lodgings elsewhere. And he did. Under the guise of Jackson, Blewitt moved swiftly, securing a room with Hannah Chapman at King's Cross Road. It was a temporary haven, a place to disappear, until, inevitably, the walls began to close in. One evening, Hannah casually leafed through a newspaper, absorbing the grim details of the murder at Beeston. A flicker of recognition passed over her as she recalled that she had family nearby. Offhandedly, she turned to her lodger. "You know the area at all?" she asked. He hesitated, but only for a second. Then came the reply, measured and dismissive. "Not much. I live at the other end." A lie. An evasion. But soon, it wouldn't matter. His time was running out. The case dragged on, its weight growing heavier with each adjournment. By July 23, the evidence was still incomplete, forcing yet another remand, this time to July 17. And it was on that day that the inevitable decision came: Blewitt would stand trial at the next assizes. When that long-awaited trial opened on the 30th of July 1900, the atmosphere inside the courtroom was charged with anticipation. Mr. Justice Ridley presided, his gaze steady over the unfolding proceedings. Blewitt's fate rested in the hands of his defense, Mr. W. J. Waugh and Mr. C. Felix Palmer, while the prosecution was built with precision by Mr. Banks, assisted by Mr. F. Brent Grotrian. Then came the testimony of James Bunny. He detailed his growing unease, the locked house at Starfold, the unanswered knocks, the repeated attempts to gain entry. Suspicion had gnawed at him, urging him to return time and again, until at last, on the 17th of June, he arrived once more. This time, he wasn't alone. He had brought the landlord. What they found inside would unravel the truth piece by piece. James Bunny took the stand, his voice steady but grim as he recounted the moment he discovered Mary Ann Blewitt's lifeless form. A shawl had been draped over her face and upper body, as though someone had attempted to conceal the horror beneath. But there was no razor. No weapon of any kind near the body. Nothing to suggest that her wounds had been self-inflicted, nothing that could explain the brutality of what had been done to her. As he spoke, Bunny dispelled lingering suspicions with measured certainty. He had never heard Charles and Marian argue. Their marriage, by all accounts, had never betrayed outward signs of strife. And as for Charles's clean-shaven appearance, there was nothing unnatural about it. It was not the act of a man in disguise, nor the mark of guilt. Blewitt had shaved off his moustache countless times before, often preferring the look of a bare face. Yet despite Bunny's testimony, the air inside the courtroom remained thick with unspoken doubt. If there had been no quarrel, no clear warning signs, then why had Marian been murdered? And more importantly, where was Charles Blewitt when it happened? Jemima Blewitt, Charles's mother, took the stand. Her testimony was calm, measured, almost wistful. She spoke of a marriage that had seemed, to all outward appearances, content. Her son and his wife had always appeared happy together. There had been no signs of discord, no whispers of trouble. But then, she revealed something else. It was not unusual for Charles to use the name Oliver Jackson. In fact, 8 months prior, he had taken out an insurance policy under that very alias. A small detail, perhaps, until now. Now, it carried a darker implication. Meanwhile, the neighbors of Star Fold added their own recollections, piecing together the final movements of Charles and Marian. Robert Coffey testified that he had last seen Charles at around 8:45 p.m. on the 8th of June, the night before the murder was discovered. He had paid attention to one detail in particular. Charles had been clean-shaven. A fact that, on its own, may have meant little. But in the context of everything that followed, it became yet another shadow cast over the case. The questioning grew sharper. Robert Coffey had claimed to have seen Charles Blewitt on the 8th of June, but how, exactly, could he be so certain? Pressed for an answer, Coffey faltered. His certainty, it turned out, was not his own. The police had told him. That was all he had to go on. He was not accusing them of fabricating evidence, only admitting that he had assumed their timeline was correct. But assumptions were dangerous things in a courtroom. Mr. Justice Ridley leaned forward, scrutinizing the witness with growing impatience. The more Coffey spoke, the more tangled his account became. His words twisted back upon themselves, his confidence eroding under the weight of judicial scrutiny. Finally, the judge turned to Mr. Banks with open frustration. "Have you a plan of this place? This witness is so stupid I can make nothing of him. I think he knows more than he has told us." The tension in the courtroom crackled. Had Coffey merely stumbled over his words, or was there something deeper beneath his confusion? The unanswered question hung in the air. Smith, at the time, thought little of it. But as the days passed, suspicion crept in. 4 or 5 days later, he read another report. This one mentioned something troubling. Blewitt had shaved his moustache off. A new unease settled over Smith. That evening, with half a grin but a sharp edge to his words, he turned to Blewitt and muttered, "Look out. The bobbies is after all them that's without a moustache." Blewitt said nothing. No smile. No deflection. No laugh to brush it away. Just silence. And in that silence, Smith knew, his workmate was hiding something. John Boyle, another fellow worker, took the stand. Like others before him, he had spoken to Blewitt about the murder. Blewitt had been dismissive, insistent that he had not been in Leeds at the time it occurred. But then came the more startling denial. He claimed he had never been married. It was a lie, blatant, calculated. A deliberate erasure of his past. Yet as the reports swirled, shifting rumors into the courtroom, another claim surfaced. Some suggested Blewitt had fled to America before resurfacing in Halifax. But Boyle recalled a different truth. Blewitt had flatly denied ever setting foot outside England. It was a tangled web of contradictions, and Blewitt stood at the center, weaving deception with every word. Then, as the trial resumed after lunch, chaos erupted in the public gallery. A crush of bodies, women scrambling for seats, tumbling over one another in their desperation to witness the proceedings firsthand. And then came the shrieks, piercing, frantic, a commotion that rippled through the courtroom. Order dissolved, the chaos spilling into the trial itself. From the bench, Mr. Justice Ridley wasted no time. He ordered court officers to remove some of the women and ensure no further overcrowding in the gallery. Just as swiftly as it had begun, the uproar was quelled. But for a moment, however brief, the trial had become more than justice. It had turned into spectacle. The defense crafted its argument with careful precision. Blewitt had gone to Halifax simply to find work, unaware of his wife's fate. There had been no crime, they insisted. Marian Blewitt had taken her own life. But when Dr. George Henry Heald, the police surgeon, took the stand, his testimony shattered that claim. He spoke with quiet authority, detailing the wounds with clinical precision: deep gashes across Marian's throat, defensive injuries on her hands. These were not the marks of a woman who had turned a blade upon herself. These were the wounds of a struggle. The wounds of murder. And in that moment, the weight of the evidence pressed down upon the courtroom. Blewitt's defense had begun to crumble. The irregularity of Marian's neck wounds was, in itself, a damning indication. This was not suicide. Had she inflicted the injury upon herself, there would have been no resistance, no struggle. The cut would have been smooth, deliberate, controlled. Of course, the defense might argue that fear and trembling hands could account for the jagged edges of the wound. But then came the far more decisive evidence. The wounds on Marian's hands told an undeniable truth. Had she cut her throat first, she would have been incapable of inflicting the deep lacerations to her own hands afterward. And if she had sliced her hands first, she would not have been able to grip the razor to complete the wound on her throat. Then there was the final, indisputable fact: no weapon had been found near the body. For the defense's version of events to hold, Marian would have had to inflict these wounds upon herself and then somehow conceal the weapon, a notion bordering on the impossible. In that moment, the weight of the evidence pressed down upon the courtroom. This was not suicide. It was murder. And the case against Charles Blewitt grew ever more inescapable. Then came the final, damning detail. The shawl. Untouched. Unstained. Had Marian truly placed it over herself, had she arranged the fabric after her injuries, the cloth would have borne the marks of her blooded hands. Yet it remained clean. The conclusion was inescapable. Someone else had placed the shawl over her. Someone who had wanted to conceal what had been done. Someone who had ensured that no weapon remained nearby. The weight of the evidence pressed down as the jury retired to consider the facts. 70 minutes passed. Then, they returned. And with them came a revelation: they were hopelessly deadlocked. The room stiffened. There was no hope for resolution. No consensus. Justice Ridley had no choice. With measured authority, he ordered a retrial. The case remained unresolved. But the truth, whatever it was, would not stay buried for long. Mr. Justice Bruce had spent his time presiding over civil cases at the assizes. But on August 16, his role shifted. He found himself overseeing the second trial of Charles Blewitt. Once again, the same prosecution and defense teams assembled, each side prepared to wage their case with renewed intensity. This time, the evidence took 2 full days to unfold. But the most striking difference came at the trial's conclusion: Justice Bruce's summing up. He lingered on one glaring inconsistency: Blewitt's unsettling reaction to his wife's death. Or rather, his utter lack of one. Had this been a tragic suicide, surely Blewitt would have been shattered upon hearing the news. Surely, he would have rushed back to Beeston, desperate to understand, desperate to mourn. But he had done nothing. No distress. No grief. No urgency to return. And that absence of emotion, that void where anguish should have been, hung heavy over the courtroom. Then came one of the simplest yet most damning details of all. A half-finished meal, left untouched on the kitchen table in Starfold. Was it reasonable to believe that a woman, in the middle of eating, would abruptly rise, abandon her plate, and take her own life? The jury deliberated, but this time, the decision came swiftly. After just 45 minutes, they returned with their verdict: guilty as charged. Blewitt's fate was sealed. And yet, in the face of his impending execution, his final letter bore no trace of remorse, no acknowledgement of his crime, only quiet pleasantries to his family. On August 18, he wrote: "My dear mother and father, I received your letter this morning, and was pleased to hear from you, but was sorry to hear that Grandad was so ill. When you come, you might all come at one time. You can come when you can make it convenient for you to do so, and I hope that Ernest and Lizzie will do so. Give my regards to all the family, from your loving son, Charles O. Blewitt." No reflection. No desperation. Just routine words from a man whose time was nearly up. Blewitt could not write, so his final letter had been dictated, yet it was devoid of any mention of the crime that had sealed his fate. No confession. No plea for forgiveness. His indifference was chilling. When someone casually remarked that he had only days left to live, Blewitt merely shrugged. What does it matter? A fellow's got to die sometime. That detachment remained unchanged even as the end drew nearer. On August 21st, 7 of Blewitt's relatives visited him, yet he never spoke of his crime. No regret. No reflection. Just silence where guilt should have lingered. Then came the eve of his execution. Blewitt sat on his prison bed, unbothered, cigar smoke curling around him as if he were a man with nothing left to lose. One of the warders began to leave his cell. "I say, where are you going?" Blewitt called out. The reply was casual, "Off for a half-pint." Blewitt grinned. "Well, old man, remember me when you are drinking it." A final jest. A fleeting moment of dark humor from a man about to meet his end. That night, he slept soundly, until the small hours of Tuesday, August 28, 1900. At 3 a.m., the restlessness began. Something had shifted. The certainty of death pressed against him. And for the first time, he did not sleep. Blewitt barely touched the breakfast laid before him. Whether from nerves or indifference, he made no protest. When the executioners entered his cell, he did not resist. James Billington, assisted by his son William, carried out the grim duty. At precisely 9 a.m., on August 28, 1900, Charles Oliver Blewitt was hanged at Leeds prison. Outside, a crowd had gathered, faces pressed against the prison gates, waiting for the final chapter in a story that had gripped the city. It was the third execution in Leeds that year. And just like that, Blewitt's name became history. The inquest was held before Mr. J.C. Malcolm, offering the final pieces of Blewitt's past. It was revealed that he had lived in America for 11 years, joined there by an uncle 3 years before his return to England. That journey home, undertaken in 1895, was marked by an accident. A fall down a hatchway aboard the ship left him with a severe bruise to the head, an incident that, in hindsight, might have carried more significance than was first realized. Yet for all this, one detail stood stark against the crime that had sealed his fate. Before the murder of Marion Blewitt, he had never been in trouble with the police. A life without criminal stain. Until Starfold. Until the shawl. Until the verdict. And then, history remembers him very differently.